June 14th, 1943. The sprawling Fisher body plant, number 1 in Grand Blanc, Michigan, hummed with an intensity that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Welding torches sparked across a production floor, stretching nearly half a mile, while overhead, cranes swung massive turret castings into position with choreographed precision. Every 11 minutes, another M4 Sherman tank rolled off the assembly line, its olive drab paint still wet, its 75mm gun gleaming under fluorescent lights. The workers, mostly women whose husbands and sons fought overseas, moved with practiced efficiency born of 24-hour shifts and 7-day workweeks. Across the Atlantic, in a cramped briefing room, at the Henschel tank works in Kassel, Germany, Oberst Heinrich Mueller stood before a map of Soviet tank production facilities, his face etched with concern that bordered on disbelief. The intelligence report in his hand, compiled from interrogations of captured Soviet officers and aerial reconnaissance photographs, painted a picture that contradicted everything German military doctrine had assumed about armored warfare. The Americans weren't just building tanks, they were building them faster than Germany could count them, let alone destroy them. Mueller had spent the morning reviewing production figures for Germany's newest weapon, the Panther tank. The Panther represented everything German engineering prided itself upon, a perfectly balanced combination of firepower, armor protection, and mobility. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Its sloped armor, copied from captured Soviet T-34s, could deflect most enemy rounds. German tank crews who transitioned from earlier models spoke of the Panther with reverence, calling it the finest tank in the world. But the production numbers told a different story, one that kept Mueller awake at night. Germany's entire industrial capacity, stretched across multiple manufacturers and constantly disrupted by Allied bombing, could produce perhaps 300 Panthers per month when everything went perfectly. And nothing went perfectly anymore. The Americans, working in factories far beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers, were producing Shermans at a rate that seemed physically impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematical disparity was staggering, though few German commanders fully grasped its implications in mid-1943, while German propaganda mocked the Sherman as a mechanically simple, undergunned machine, a Tommy cooker that burned too easily when struck by superior German weapons. American factories were demonstrating that simplicity had its own devastating advantages. The Sherman's design deliberately avoided complexity. Its right radial engine, originally developed for aircraft, was reliable and easy to maintain. Its suspension system used readily available components. Its armor plates could be cut and welded by workers with minimal training. This design philosophy, born from American automotive mass production techniques, meant that factories across the United States could build Shermans simultaneously. The Fisher body plant in Grand Blanc, the Chrysler Detroit Arsenal, the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, the Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Ford's assembly line in Michigan, American Locomotive in New York, 11 major manufacturers, coordinated by the War Production Board, churning out identical tanks using standardized parts and production methods that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier. Lieutenant Klaus Weber commanded a Panther tank in the 2nd Panzer Division, recently transferred from the Eastern Front to France in anticipation of the inevitable Allied invasion. Weber was a veteran of Kursk, where his unit had watched the largest tank battle in history unfold across the steppes of southern Russia. He had seen Tigers and Panthers destroy Soviet T-34s by the dozens, had witnessed the superiority of German optics and gunnery. He believed, with the certainty of a man whose life depended on that belief, that German tanks were simply better than anything the Allies could field. His crew shared this confidence. Gunnar Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, had destroyed 7 Soviet tanks during the Kursk offensive, each kill achieved at ranges where enemy guns couldn't effectively respond. Driver Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt took pride in the Panther's mechanical sophistication, its Maybach engine and complex transmission representing what he considered the pinnacle of German engineering. They had heard about American Shermans, mostly through scuttlebutt and propaganda broadcasts, and what they heard reinforced their sense of superiority. The Sherman's 75mm gun, they were told, could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor. The American tank's relatively thin armor made it vulnerable to every German anti-tank weapon, from the 88mm gun down to the Panzerfaust infantry rocket. German training manuals from this period, preserved in the Bundesarchiv military archives, explicitly stated that Panthers held a 3-to-1 advantage over American medium tanks in direct combat, a ratio that German commanders considered conservative. But the manuals never addressed the question that would prove decisive. What happened when the ratio wasn't 3-to-1, but 1-to-8? What tactical doctrine applied when American Shermans outnumbered German Panthers by margins that made individual superiority irrelevant? Spring of 1944 brought intelligence reports to German armored commands that should have prompted urgent strategic reassessment, but instead were largely dismissed as Allied propaganda or statistical errors. Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Photographs of British ports showed something that seemed impossible: hundreds upon hundreds of tanks staged for shipment to France. Intelligence officers, counting the vehicles in these photographs, came up with numbers that their commanders refused to believe. Surely the Allies couldn't have accumulated that many tanks, not with shipping constraints, not with U-boat attacks, not while simultaneously fighting in Italy and supplying the Soviet Union. Major Friedrich Koch, assigned to Panzer Group West's intelligence section, compiled a report in April of 1944 that attempted to calculate Allied armoured strength based on all available intelligence sources. His conclusion, documented in records later captured by Allied forces and now preserved in the National Archives, suggested that the Americans and British had accumulated over 8,000 tanks in England awaiting the invasion of France. Koch's superior officer returned the report with a handwritten note stating that such figures were clearly exaggerated and should be revised downward by at least 50% before presentation to higher headquarters. The actual number exceeded 12,000 tanks. American production statistics, compiled quarterly by the War Production Board and published in documents that were not classified since the United States, felt no need to hide its industrial capacity, told the story in stark numerical terms. In 1942, American factories produced 4,248 Sherman tanks. In 1943, production increased to 21,761 Shermans. By 1944, monthly production rates exceeded 1,500 tanks, with no indication of slowdown or capacity limits. The German response to these figures, when they were brought to the attention of senior commanders, typically involved dismissing them as impossible or arguing that quantity couldn't overcome quality. This belief persisted, despite mounting evidence from the Eastern Front, where Soviet numerical superiority was grinding down German armoured formations, regardless of their technical advantages. The Wehrmacht had developed elaborate tactical doctrines for fighting outnumbered, sophisticated procedures for ambush, maneuver, and concentration of force that could, under ideal circumstances, allow inferior numbers of superior tanks to achieve local victories. What German doctrine never adequately addressed was what happened when the numerical disparity became so extreme that local victories became strategically irrelevant. When destroying 3 or 4 or even 5 enemy tanks still left dozens more advancing toward your position. When every engagement depleted your irreplaceable forces, while the enemy could absorb losses that would cripple a German formation and return to combat strength within days. June 6, 1944. The massive naval bombardment that preceded the Normandy landings announced the arrival of a force that would test every assumption German commanders held about armoured warfare. Within hours of the initial assault, Sherman tanks were wading ashore from landing ship tanks, their waterproofed engines coughing to life as they emerged from the surf onto French beaches. By nightfall of D-Day, despite fierce German resistance and heavy casualties, over 200 American and British tanks had reached French soil. Lieutenant Weber's Panther sat in a concealed position near Caen, where the 2nd Panzer Division had been held in reserve, awaiting orders to counterattack the invasion force. The sounds of naval gunfire rolled across the Norman countryside like distant thunder, and Weber found himself calculating angles and ranges, wargaming the engagements to come. His Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters under optimal conditions. The Sherman needed to close to perhaps 800 meters to have any realistic chance of penetrating a Panther's frontal armor. Simple mathematics suggested that Weber's crew would kill multiple enemy tanks before being threatened. But Weber's calculations, like those of every German tank commander, assumed that battles would be fought under conditions where German advantages in optics, gunnery, and armor could be fully exploited. The fighting that erupted across Normandy in June and July of 1944 demonstrated how rarely such ideal conditions existed. The Norman bocage, a countryside divided into small fields by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows, created a nightmare environment for armored operations. Visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. Roads were narrow, confined by the high banks, making maneuver nearly impossible. Tank commanders who had trained on the open steppes of Russia or the rolling terrain of Poland found themselves fighting in what amounted to a series of close-range ambushes where technical superiority meant far less than positioning and luck. American tank crews, arriving in Normandy with minimal combat experience but extensive training, faced their first engagements with German armor with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew their Shermans were outgunned. They had been briefed on the Panther's capabilities, warned that frontal engagements would likely prove fatal, but they also possessed advantages that German intelligence had largely failed to account for. Superior radios meant American tanks could coordinate movements with precision that German formations, often operating with limited or unreliable communications, couldn't match. Forward observers could call in artillery strikes with devastating accuracy, forcing German tanks to displace from optimal firing positions or be destroyed by high explosive shells. And, most significantly, American commanders could afford to lose tanks in a way that German commanders simply couldn't. The 1st Infantry Division's tank battalions, supporting the beachhead expansion in early June, demonstrated this brutal calculus in a series of engagements near Colleville. When German Panthers from the Panzerlehr Division established blocking positions along key roads, American tank commanders didn't attempt to engage in long-range gunnery duels. Instead, they called in artillery to suppress the German positions, used infantry to infiltrate through the bocage, and maneuvered multiple Shermans to attack from flanks and rear where even the mighty Panther was vulnerable. Staff Sergeant Robert Hammond commanded a Sherman in the 2nd Armored Division's advance towards St. Lo in early July. His first encounter with a Panther came on a narrow road hemmed in by 8-foot hedgerows, where his Sherman rounded a corner to find itself facing a German tank at a range of less than 50 meters. Hammond's gunner, Corporal James Riley, fired instantly, not even bothering to aim for specific weak points at such close range. The 75mm round struck the Panther's gun mantle, a relatively thick piece of armor, and failed to penetrate. The German gunner's return fire, however, punched through the Sherman's frontal armor like it was cardboard, exactly as German crews had been taught to expect. Hammond and 2 of his crew managed to bail out before ammunition ignited, but the loader and bow gunner died in the fire that consumed their tank within seconds. Hammond would survive the war, but his Sherman, tank number 2018 in the 2nd Armored Division's inventory, was one of literally thousands that would burn in the Norman hedgerows. Yet within 48 hours, a replacement Sherman arrived for Hammond's platoon, driven off a landing ship tank at Utah Beach, its odometer showing just the miles from the factory to the port. The tank carried a full load of ammunition, extra track sections welded to its hull for additional armor protection, and was crewed by replacements who had been training at Fort Knox just 3 weeks earlier. The German Panther that had destroyed Hammond's tank, meanwhile, remained in position, irreplaceable and increasingly isolated as American forces maneuvered around its flanks. This pattern repeated itself across Normandy throughout June and July of 1944. German Panthers and Tigers achieved remarkable individual kill ratios, often destroying 3 or 4 or 5 Shermans before being knocked out themselves. But the mathematics worked against Germany in ways that transcended tactical excellence. For every Panther lost, Germany needed weeks of production time, scarce raw materials, and increasingly dangerous transportation through Allied-controlled airspace to deliver a replacement. For every Sherman lost, America needed 11 minutes of production time and a Liberty ship that faced minimal interference crossing the Atlantic. Major Koch, still compiling intelligence assessments for Panzer Group West, updated his estimates of Allied armored strength in late July. His new figures suggested that despite losing over 800 tanks in Normandy since D-Day, American and British forces had actually increased their operational tank strength through continuous replacements and reinforcements. The report was filed and apparently never reached senior commanders who might have grasped its implications. Lieutenant Weber's Panther survived the Normandy campaign through a combination of skill, caution, and luck that characterized German armored operations in France. His crew became adept at hit-and-run tactics, firing from concealed positions and immediately displacing before American artillery could respond. They learned to avoid roads where American air superiority made movement suicidal during daylight hours. They mastered the art of fighting outnumbered, accepting that every engagement would pit them against multiple enemy tanks. In his journal, later captured and preserved in the Bundesarchiv, Weber recorded his growing frustration with a situation that defied all his training and experience. "We destroy their tanks," he wrote in early August, and more appear the next day. "We kill their crews, and new crews arrive within hours. Our intelligence insists we are winning the tank battles, and perhaps we are. But we are losing the war of production, and that is the only battle that ultimately matters." By late August of 1944, as the Falaise pocket collapsed and German forces retreated in chaos from Normandy, the pattern had become undeniable. German armored divisions that had entered the Normandy campaign with hundreds of tanks were reduced to dozens of operational vehicles, not primarily through combat losses, though those were substantial, but through mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, and the impossibility of recovering damaged tanks under constant Allied air attack. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had deployed to Normandy with over 190 tanks, escaped the Falaise pocket with fewer than 20 operational vehicles. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of Germany's elite formations, was effectively destroyed, and while German propaganda could point to impressive kill ratios, noting accurately that German tanks had destroyed American and British armor at ratios of 3-to-1 or better, such statistics meant nothing when the other side could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. The American approach to armored warfare, derided by German professionals as crude and wasteful, proved devastatingly effective precisely because it accepted losses as inevitable and planned accordingly. Sherman crews were trained knowing that survival rates were poor, that their tanks would likely burn if hit, that they were fighting in machines inferior to the best German armor, but they were also trained in tactics that exploited American advantages, coordination, artillery support, air cover, and above all, the certainty that destroyed tanks would be replaced, that casualties would be filled with fresh crews, that the industrial machines supporting them would never falter. Staff Sergeant William Becker, commanding a Sherman in the 4th Armored Division during the breakout from Normandy, captured this mindset in a letter home that somehow survived the war and was later donated to the Veterans History Project. "We know the Germans have better tanks," he wrote to his wife in Illinois, "but we've got more of them, and that's what counts. They can kill 5 of our tanks, and we'll send 6 more. They can't replace theirs. Simple math, honey. We're going to win because we can afford to lose." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. September of 1944 saw American armored divisions racing across France, exploiting the German collapse with advances that covered hundreds of miles in weeks. The pursuit phase of the campaign demonstrated American armor's operational mobility, as Sherman tanks proved capable of sustained high-speed movement over long distances, something the more complex Panthers struggled to match. German formations attempting to establish defensive lines found themselves outflanked by American columns that operated around the clock, refueling from organic logistics that could keep pace with the advance. The Third Army's drive across France consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that would have paralyzed any other military force, but American logistics, built on the same mass production principles that manufactured Shermans, delivered everything needed. Convoys of trucks, many built at the same factories that produced tanks, ran continuous shuttle routes from Normandy ports to frontline units. When bridges were destroyed, American engineers built replacements within hours using prefabricated components. When supply lines stretched too long, C-47 transport aircraft dropped fuel and ammunition directly to advancing units. Lieutenant Weber's Panther, now operating with a scratch formation of survivors from multiple destroyed divisions, retreated toward the German border in a fighting withdrawal that tested every skill he possessed. His crew had become intimate with their machine's limitations in ways that technical manuals never addressed. The Panther's final drive, stressed by combat and inadequate maintenance, produced ominous grinding sounds that suggested imminent failure. The engine consumed oil at alarming rates, leaving blue smoke trails that invited air attack. The complex transmission, Germany's finest engineering achievement according to peacetime propaganda, required constant nursing to prevent catastrophic breakdown. During a brief halt near Metz in mid-September, Weber's crew worked through the night attempting to repair their transmission with improvised parts, knowing that a breakdown meant abandonment of the tank since recovery vehicles had long since been lost or destroyed. Schmidt, the driver, removed the access panels with tools that were supposed to be in the tank's onboard kit, but had been lost somewhere in the Normandy retreat. Hoffman, the gunner, stood watch, while Weber and the loader attempted repairs that should have been performed by trained mechanics in a properly equipped workshop. They managed to coax another 100 kilometers of movement from the failing transmission, enough to reach German lines, where the Panther was immediately commandeered by a different crew. Weber and his men were reassigned to a different tank, a replacement Panther that had been rushed from the factory with barely adequate testing, its engine still tight from lack of break-in, its gun sights requiring adjustment that no one had time to perform properly. The contrast between German and American logistics became stark as the campaign moved into autumn. American tank crews could expect regular maintenance, replacement parts flown or trucked from ports, and complete replacement of catastrophically damaged vehicles. Within days, German crews made do with increasingly desperate expedients, cannibalizing destroyed tanks for parts, performing field repairs that were barely adequate, accepting deteriorating mechanical reliability because no alternative existed. By October of 1944, German tank production had actually increased from earlier in the year. Despite Allied bombing, the factories were producing Panthers and Tiger IIs at respectable rates, but getting those tanks from factories to frontline units proved increasingly impossible. Allied air superiority meant that rail movements during daylight were suicidal. Tank transporters and the fuel needed to move them were in desperately short supply. New tanks sat at railheads, waiting for transport that never arrived, or were driven to the front under their own power, consuming irreplaceable fuel and accumulating wear on transmissions and final drives that would fail within weeks. The Wehrmacht's October production reports, captured after the war and analyzed by American military historians, revealed a paradox that characterized Germany's entire armored situation. Production was adequate. Distribution was catastrophic. German factories built 211 Panthers in October of 1944. American factories built 1,468 Shermans in the same month, and virtually every one of those Shermans reached combat units ready for action. Lieutenant William Morrison commanded a Sherman platoon in the 1st Armored Division during the approach to the German border in November. His after-action reports, filed with meticulous detail and preserved in the National Archives, documented a curious evolution in American tactical thinking. Morrison noted that his crews had stopped fearing Panthers with the same intensity they had in Normandy, not because Panthers had become less deadly, their guns still destroyed Shermans with brutal efficiency, but because American tankers had learned that Panthers could be beaten through coordination and maneuver. Morrison's platoon developed a standard procedure for Panther encounters: identify the German tank's position, usually from its muzzle flash after it destroyed the first American tank, immediately call for artillery or air support to suppress the position, maneuver at least 2 Shermans to flanking positions, while a third provided frontal suppressing fire, attack simultaneously from multiple directions, accepting that the frontal tank would likely be destroyed, but confident that flanking tanks would get killing shots into the Panther's side armor. The tactic was brutal and cost lives, but it worked consistently enough that American tank commanders stopped treating Panther encounters as special events requiring emergency responses. They became routine problems with established solutions. Deadly routine, perhaps, but routine nonetheless. This psychological shift from fear of German armor to pragmatic acceptance of how to defeat it marked a fundamental change in the campaign's character. German commanders noted this change with growing concern. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from November and December of 1944, compiled from interrogations of captured American tankers and observations from frontline units, documented what they termed increasing American aggressiveness in armored engagements. Where American tanks had previously exhibited caution when facing German armor, they now attacked with coordination and confidence that suggested they no longer respected German technical superiority. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate December offensive through the Ardennes, would provide the final test of whether German quality could overcome American quantity. German planners assembled substantial armored forces for the attack, including approximately 650 tanks and assault guns, an impressive concentration by late 1944 standards. The force included some of Germany's newest and most powerful armor, King Tigers and Panthers, fresh from the factories. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise and drove deep into American lines, creating the dramatic bulge that gave the battle its name. German tank columns, many commanded by veterans of the Eastern Front, exploited their breakthrough with skill and determination. For several days it appeared that German armor might achieve a strategic breakthrough despite overall Allied superiority. But the American response demonstrated exactly why numerical superiority ultimately trumped technical advantage. Within 48 hours of the German attack, American armored divisions from across the European theater were racing toward the battle, the 4th Armored Division executing Patton's famous 90-degree turn from operations in the south, the 2nd Armored Division rushing from Belgium, the 3rd Armored Division redeploying from the Aachen sector. Each division brought hundreds of Sherman tanks, supported by the logistical infrastructure that could keep them fueled, armed, and repaired regardless of weather or tactical situation. The German armored thrust, spectacular in its initial success, ground to a halt not primarily because of American defensive resistance, though that was fierce, but because German tanks ran out of fuel. The offensive's planning had assumed capture of American fuel dumps, a desperate gamble that failed when American forces destroyed or defended their supply depots. German Panthers and Tigers, magnificent machines capable of dominating any battlefield, sat immobilized for lack of fuel, while American Shermans, mechanically simpler but fed by an inexhaustible logistics pipeline, maneuvered around them. Oberst Mueller, who had studied American production figures back in 1943 with growing concern, found himself commanding a panzer regiment during the Bulge offensive. His Tigers achieved remarkable tactical successes in the battle's opening days, destroying American armor at the impressive ratios that German doctrine predicted. But by December 20th, his regiment was immobilized 20 miles short of its objectives, the magnificent Tiger tanks reduced to static pillboxes as fuel trucks that were supposed to arrive never appeared. Mueller recorded in his journal, later captured and preserved, a bitter recognition of reality. "We have built the finest tanks in the world," he wrote, "and we cannot supply them with fuel. The Americans have built adequate tanks, and they arrive at the battlefield with full fuel tanks, loaded ammunition racks, and confident crews who know that if their tank is destroyed, another will replace it tomorrow. We have achieved tactical excellence. They have achieved strategic certainty. The war is lost. The collapse of the German Bulge offensive in late December and early January demonstrated conclusively what should have been apparent from production statistics all along. Germany simply could not build, supply, and maintain enough tanks to contest American numerical superiority. The Wehrmacht's armored forces, which had begun the war with qualitative and quantitative advantages, now possessed only quality, and quality alone couldn't overcome the mathematical realities of industrial warfare. January of 1945 saw American and British forces pushing into Germany itself, their armored spearheads now operating on German soil where every mile of retreat brought Wehrmacht forces closer to total collapse. Sherman tanks, those supposedly inferior machines that German propaganda had mocked, rolled through German towns in columns that stretched for miles, so numerous that German defenders often couldn't count them all before being overwhelmed. Lieutenant Weber's third Panther of the war, this one received in January with a replacement crew after his previous team had been reassigned to infantry duties due to tank shortages, participated in the defense of the Rhineland with the grim knowledge that defeat was inevitable. German commanders no longer spoke of victory, only of delaying the inevitable collapse long enough for some political miracle to occur. Weber's orders were simple: hold specific positions for specific periods, then retreat before being encircled, fight, withdraw, repeat until there was nowhere left to withdraw. The American advance into Germany revealed the full extent of the production disparity in ways that shocked even experienced German tank commanders. During the Roer River crossing in February, German observation posts counted over 300 American tanks concentrated for a single assault on a 10-mile front. The American doctrine had evolved from the desperate improvisation of Normandy into a refined system of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Artillery preparation destroyed German defensive positions. Airstrikes eliminated any German armor attempting to counterattack, and then the Shermans advanced in waves so dense that destroying individual tanks accomplished nothing. Weber engaged American armor for the final time near Cologne in early March. His Panther, positioned in rubble that had once been a residential neighborhood, had excellent fields of fire down a main avenue. When American tanks appeared, Weber's gunner, Hoffman, now the only original crew member still with him, acquired the target with practiced efficiency. The 75mm gun fired, and a Sherman, 800 meters distant, lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Hoffman traversed to a second target and fired again. Another Sherman hit, this one brewing up as ammunition ignited. Weber felt a moment of grim satisfaction. The same mechanical excellence that had sustained German tank crews throughout the war still functioned. His Panther remained superior to individual American tanks in direct combat, but before Hoffman could engage a third target, the entire block erupted in explosions as American artillery, called in by forward observers the moment Weber's Panther revealed its position, blanketed the area with high explosive shells. Weber ordered immediate withdrawal, and Schmidt, still an exceptional driver, despite everything, backed the Panther out of position and into a covered alley in less than 10 seconds. They survived, but the engagement demonstrated what had become standard American procedure. Accept initial losses, identify enemy positions, destroy them with artillery or air power, advance with fresh tanks. The Americans could afford to lose the first two Shermans because dozens more followed. German tanks that revealed their positions rarely survived the artillery response, and those that did found themselves facing fresh waves of American armor that ground forward regardless of casualties. The final statistics of German tank production, compiled after the war, from captured records and analyzed extensively by military historians, revealed both impressive achievement and tragic futility. From 1943 through the war's end, German factories produced approximately 6,000 Panthers, remarkable considering the Allied bombing campaign and Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. Each Panther represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, scarce raw materials, and engineering excellence that Germany could barely afford. American factories, in the same period, produced approximately 39,000 Shermans. The disparity wasn't 6-1 or even 7-1. It was approximately 6.5-1, a ratio that rendered German technical superiority strategically irrelevant, even if every German tank destroyed 6 American tanks before being knocked out itself, which actual combat records showed rarely occurred. Germany would still lose the war of attrition. But the true ratio of American to German tank production exceeded even these figures when all American production was considered. The 49,234 Shermans built during the entire war represented just the M4 medium tank. American factories also produced thousands of M3 light tanks, M10 and M36 tank destroyers, and various other armored fighting vehicles. Total American armored vehicle production exceeded 70,000 units during the war years. Germany's total tank production, including all models from obsolete Markwurfs through Tigers and Panthers, reached approximately 25,000 units during the same period. The mathematical advantage America held was approximately 3-1 in total armored vehicles, but when considering only modern, combat-capable tanks in the war's final years, the advantage approached 8-1 or higher. Major Koch, who had spent years compiling intelligence on Allied production capacity, found himself commanding a scratch battalion of infantry in the Ruhr Pocket in April of 1945. His expertise in armored warfare rendered moot by the absence of German tanks. In one of his final journal entries before being captured, Koch reflected on the intelligence assessments he had made years earlier. "Every number I reported was accurate," he wrote. "Every warning I provided was valid. We knew the Americans could outproduce us. We knew their industrial capacity exceeded ours by magnitudes we couldn't match. But we believed, desperately wanted to believe, that quality could overcome quantity, that superior German engineering and tactical excellence would prevail. We were wrong. The final German armored counterattacks in April of 1945 demonstrated not German strength, but German desperation. Tank units scraped together from training schools, equipped with vehicles pulled from repair depots, manned by crews with minimal experience, launched attacks that achieved nothing except to delay the inevitable by hours or days. American responses to these attacks revealed the full evolution of Allied armored doctrine. Sherman tanks, supported by overwhelming artillery and complete air superiority, simply crushed German resistance through the application of force so overwhelming that German tactical skill became irrelevant. Staff Sergeant Hammond, who had survived, having his Sherman destroyed in Normandy and fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany, commanded a Sherman during the final advances into central Germany in late April. His crew had fought in 4 different tanks during the campaign, each previous vehicle destroyed by German fire, each time receiving a replacement within days. Hammond's current Sherman, the 4th, bearing his crew's nicknames and good luck charms, rolled into yet another German town where sporadic resistance continued, despite the hopelessness of Germany's situation. A Panther appeared from a side street, its long gun traversing toward Hammond's Sherman with the mechanical precision that characterized German armor, even in defeat. Hammond's gunner fired first, a hasty shot that struck the Panther's turret but failed to penetrate. The German return fire hit Hammond's Sherman in the frontal armor, and for the 3rd time in the campaign, Hammond found himself bailing out of a burning tank as ammunition cooked off in the heat. But unlike Normandy, where losing a tank meant days of uncertainty before receiving a replacement, Hammond's platoon had a spare Sherman in the company maintenance area. By the following morning, Hammond and his surviving crew members were back in action in a different tank, continuing the advance as if the previous day's near-death experience had been merely an inconvenient delay. This represented the ultimate expression of American industrial warfare. Losses that would cripple a German formation were simply absorbed, replaced, and overcome through the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority. The Panther, that had destroyed Hammond's tank, was itself destroyed later that day by American artillery, and no replacement would arrive to continue its mission. May 8, 1945, brought Germany's unconditional surrender, and with it the end of the European armored war. The statistics compiled in the war's immediate aftermath painted a picture of industrial warfare carried to its logical extreme. American Sherman production had reached 49,234 tanks. German Panther production had reached approximately 6,000 tanks. The ratio, roughly 8-to-1, had proven decisive in ways that transcended individual technical specifications or tactical excellence. The human cost of this industrial disparity was measured in different ways by different nations. American tank crews suffered horrific casualties throughout the campaign, with Sherman crews experiencing some of the highest casualty rates of any American combat arm. Approximately 60% of American tankers who entered combat in Europe were killed, wounded, or captured during the war. The Sherman's vulnerability to German guns, a technical reality that American soldiers paid for with their lives, remained a source of bitter controversy in post-war analysis. Yet, those same statistics revealed a crucial truth about industrial warfare. Despite suffering 60% casualties, American armored forces grew stronger throughout the campaign, not weaker. Replacements arrived faster than casualties accumulated. New tanks appeared faster than old ones were destroyed. The system, brutal and wasteful as it was, functioned exactly as designed. German tank crews faced an inverse experience. Their casualty rates were similar to American rates, approximately 60% killed, wounded, or captured. But German armored strength declined steadily throughout the campaign, despite these crews' individual excellence. Destroyed tanks weren't replaced. Veteran crews were increasingly diluted with inexperienced replacements. The technical superiority of Panthers and Tigers became strategically meaningless when there weren't enough of them to contest American advances. Lieutenant Weber survived the war, surrendering to American forces in early May when his final Panther ran out of fuel in a forest near Dresden. In interviews conducted decades later as part of German military history projects, Weber spoke with the detachment of a professional soldier assessing a campaign long concluded. The Sherman wasn't a bad tank, he reflected. It was an adequate tank, built in quantities that made adequacy sufficient. Our Panthers were superior machines individually, but warfare isn't fought by individual machines. It's fought by industrial systems, and the American system proved superior to ours in every way that mattered. The post-war analysis of the Sherman versus Panther contest became a case study in military procurement and industrial strategy. American military historians defended the Sherman's design, arguing that its simplicity and reliability made it the ideal tank for a global war requiring massive production and logistics. German historians and many American critics pointed to the unnecessary casualties suffered by Sherman crews who fought in tanks that couldn't match German armor in direct combat. The debate, which continued for decades and persists in modified form to the present day, often missed the fundamental point that the war itself had demonstrated. In industrial warfare between peer powers, the ability to produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities proved more valuable than the ability to produce superior equipment in limited numbers. Germany built arguably the finest tanks of World War II. America built enough tanks to win World War II. History recorded which approach succeeded. The legacy of the Sherman's numerical superiority extended far beyond the immediate war years into Cold War military thinking and procurement strategy. American defense planners, having witnessed firsthand how industrial capacity determined armored warfare outcomes, prioritized production capability and logistical sustainability in all subsequent tank designs. The M26 Pershing, which arrived too late to significantly impact the European war, evolved into the M46, M47, and M48 series that served through Korea and Vietnam. Each design reflecting lessons learned about balancing quality with quantity. Soviet military planners, who had employed similar mass production strategies with the T-34 tank, drew comparable conclusions. The Cold War tank forces of both superpowers emphasized designs that could be manufactured in large numbers, maintained in field conditions, and supported by robust logistics, direct descendants of the Sherman's design philosophy, even when the tanks themselves bore no physical resemblance to the M4. The German approach to armored warfare, emphasizing technical excellence and individual superiority, found fewer adherents in the post-war era. While some nations continued to pursue quality over quantity in tank design, the fundamental lesson of the Sherman versus Panther contest remained inescapable. In sustained conflict between industrial powers, the side that could field and maintain more tanks usually prevailed, regardless of individual vehicle capabilities. The men who had crewed Shermans carried complex feelings about their tanks throughout their lives. Many veterans expressed bitter resentment about fighting in machines they knew were inferior to German armor, arguing that better equipment might have saved lives and shortened the war. Others defended the Sherman, pointing to its reliability, ease of maintenance, and the confidence that came from knowing destroyed tanks would be replaced. Staff Sergeant Becker, who had written to his wife about simple math and replacement tanks, survived the war and returned to Illinois, where he worked in a manufacturing plant until retirement. In an oral history interview conducted in the 1980s, Becker reflected on the apparent contradiction between the Sherman's technical inferiority and ultimate success. "It wasn't a great tank," he said, "but it was a good enough tank, and there were enough of us that good enough turned out to be plenty. The Germans had better tanks, but they didn't have enough of them. We had enough, and that's what won." The physical evidence of the Sherman's numerical dominance remained visible across Europe for years after the war's end. Destroyed Shermans littered the route from Normandy to Berlin, marking every major battle with burned-out hulks that took years to clear. But for every destroyed Sherman, records showed that Germany had lost tanks at comparable or higher rates while possessing no ability to replace them at anything approaching American rates. The final accounting, compiled from unit records, production statistics, and post-war analysis, revealed numbers that validated the American approach despite its human cost. Of the 49,234 Shermans produced, approximately 20,000 saw combat service in Europe. Of those 20,000, approximately 11,000 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair during the campaign. Yet, at war's end, American armored forces in Europe remained at full strength, equipped with functioning Shermans ready for continued operations had the war continued. Germany, by contrast, entered the war's final month with fewer than 1,000 operational tanks of all types, despite having produced 25,000 tanks during the war years. The mathematics of attrition warfare, brutal and unforgiving, had ground German armored forces to irrelevance through the systematic application of American industrial power. The mockery that German tankers had directed at Shermans in the war's early years, the cruel jokes about Tommy Cookers and cardboard tanks, faded into bitter silence as the reality of defeat became undeniable. Yes, Panthers were superior to Shermans in direct combat. Yes, German crews achieved impressive kill ratios. Yes, German engineering had produced remarkable machines. But none of it mattered when the Americans could lose 6 tanks and field 7 more the next day, while Germany couldn't replace the single Panther it lost. The story of the Sherman versus Panther contest became, in the final analysis, a story about different approaches to modern warfare. Germany chose quality, technical excellence, engineering perfection. America chose quantity, industrial efficiency, logistical sustainability. The verdict of history, written in the occupation of Berlin by American tanks and the complete destruction of German armored forces, demonstrated which approach better suited the total war that World War II became. Oberst Mueller, who had studied American production figures with growing alarm back in 1943, survived the war and became a professor of military history at a German university. His lectures on armored warfare attended by a new generation of German officers in the rebuilding Bundeswehr, emphasized the lessons he had learned at such terrible cost. Never fight an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeds yours by an order of magnitude, he would tell students. Never assume that quality alone can overcome sufficient quantity. And never ever underestimate an opponent who can replace their losses faster than you can inflict them. The 49,234 Sherman tanks built during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They represented a system, an approach to warfare, a philosophy of industrial power that proved decisive in the 20th century's defining conflict. Each individual Sherman might have been inferior to each individual Panther, but collectively, those 49,000 Shermans crushed 6,000 Panthers through the relentless application of force that German industry simply could not match. The crews who fought in those Shermans, who died in burning tanks, who climbed into replacement vehicles knowing their chances of survival remained poor, deserved better equipment than they received. This truth, acknowledged by post-war analysis and veteran testimony, remains valid and important. But those same crews, through their courage and the industrial system supporting them, won the war they were sent to fight. The Sherman, adequate but available in overwhelming numbers, proved sufficient for victory even when individual battles suggested otherwise. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.